I think, a lot of people are really interested by what they did in these first two rounds because they went out and got skill position players. And, I don't think a lot of us were expecting them to get Makai Lemon when they got him, but they were able to move up three spots from 23 to 20 and snag the wide receiver from Southern Cal. A lot of us had them taking an offensive lineman, or at least, going probably in the trenches. But the Lemon pick, uh, I don't know. Was it a complete surprise in light of the AJ Brown stuff? How do you view it?
I think the bigger surprise to me was that Makai Lemon was available to the Eagles within a reasonable trade up within a few spots from where they were originally selecting it at 23 overall. I think this was arguably the second best receiver in this draft behind Carnell Tate. So the fact that he was available to the Eagles, I think, was quite surprising. As we were getting ready for the draft, as you mentioned, I think offensive tackle seemed like the most logical first round pick for the Eagles this year. Given not only the need, but also the quality of tackles that were likely to be available around where the Eagles were picking. But ultimately, a lot of those tackles came off the board. Like, Caden Proctor got taken at 12th overall by the Miami Dolphins. Blake Miller, Monroe Freeling also coming off at 17 and 19 ahead of the Eagles. So perhaps they could have moved up into that range, but I mean, two fourth round picks just to move up to 20 is quite a bit. So I guess from the standpoint of the fact that the Eagles were not able to get one of the tackles that were in that round and ultimately ended up taking a receiver, not entirely surprising given the value that they place on the position, given, I guess, what we know about or what we expect to happen to AJ Brown this year. And the fact that the Eagles always say they aren't drafting for position necessarily. They are trying to take the best player available. And Makai Lemon evidently, had a first round grade and he was there for them and they were able to go up and get him.
Yeah, the way I kind of view this is that they had their eye set on getting a tackle. Everything that I had been told leading up into the draft, certainly they're going to put as much energy as they can into every position, but they were really focused a lot on these top guys. And I think Caden Proctor probably was their guy beyond Spencer Fano, who went number 9. But Proctor, I think they felt could probably drop close enough where they'd be able to get him. And I think 12 would have, they would have had to jump into 10 and 11. That would have been quite a jump, and they would have had to give up a lot of draft picks to get him there. So once he went, it became difficult for them to get a tackle. I don't think Blake Miller, just from my feeling, was probably someone that they were really primed to take. Monroe Freeling, I had him up there as either Proctor or Freeling. My guess is either they felt that there was no way that the Carolina was trading, out of that or anyone before that. So that was probably why they couldn't get him. And then at that point, I think having been around Howie, knowing how he does this, knowing that, 2014 draft in particular, and they kind of they got in a bind after everybody they wanted at that pick wasn't there and they traded back and they got stuck taking Marcus Smith. I think that those lessons have very much informed how Howie Roseman works in the first round. And they saw, okay, here's this guy that's dropping, Makai Lemon. We need to get a player that we have ranked high. And I think he mentioned top 15. My guess is he might have been either a 14th or 15th guy on their board. Let's go get someone good value here. Certainly it's a position I don't think necessarily of need. And as I mentioned before, and as you mentioned, I don't think it was because of like AJ Brown that had to fill a hole. Like you just can't draft that way. But it is a nice kind of little additional gift and able to address that position. But I think for them, it was like that's kind of what motivated Howie Roseman there in getting value. When you look at the player, clearly everything he's done in college, he was the Fred Biletnikoff winner as the best receiver in college football last year. You look at the numbers, you look at production. I mean, he's an enticing guy. What do you make of kind of what you've seen or the traits or what you've heard from people? You spoke to a number of his coaches. What do you think about Lemon, the player?
I think what strikes me first, and I guess more overall from the coaches that I spoke to his high school coach, spoke to one of his receivers coaches at USC, and I think the character and the makeup really stand out with Makai Lemon, knowing what we know about how much the Eagles value those kinds of things, and not just how competitive he is, because I feel like, these guys are they're NFL players. They're a lot of them are competitive, but all of them are competitive. But with Lemon in particular, it's kind of the toughness that he has displayed, especially at his size. 5'11", 194 pounds, relatively undersized for a receiver at the NFL level, but to be able to compensate for that with just like his willingness to kind of get in the dirty areas of the field and do the work, and his ability to come down with contested catches. He's got really great hands. I think he only had 4 drops throughout his entire college football career. And even though he might not have like the greatest straight line speed, he still is a really explosive player, and still a great athlete. So I think there's a lot to like about Lemon, and especially his production. He was incredibly productive over his 2 seasons, really full time as a receiver in their offense at USC. It's just a question of whether or not he'll be able to translate all of the success that he had at USC to the NFL level at his size, and be able to thrive in this offense. So it'll be interesting. I'm eager to see how it'll all come together for him. But yeah, he seems like a really intense guy, and I think that kind of came through all like the pre-draft stuff that we saw. You saw it at the combine when he was up there on the podium, and you even kind of saw that intensity when he was with us on the podium in the Eagles facility, even though I think he was a little bit like more relaxed in that setting. But like the intensity with him definitely shines through in his interactions with the media.
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see how he also, it works within this new offense, right? I mean, like middle of the field, he's a slot receiver. Like, they say he can play on the outside. My guess is most of the snaps will come inside early on. Look, in this scheme, in most NFL schemes, you're going to have to play inside out, right? We all know that Devontae Smith can play out of the slot, and he's had some of his best moments there. But with Lemon, the one glaring kind of check mark against him is the speed thing, right? He only ran like a 4.53 40 at the combine. It's just one day. Doesn't mean that he can't run faster than that. And then there's on-field speed versus, combine speed. So, I don't really kind of take, I don't put great emphasis on that, but, if he got to the NFL and didn't thrive, and it'll probably be because of that. And that happens a lot in the NFL. And then you look back upon it, you're like, oh, well, he ran a 4.5. This is why he couldn't get separation at the NFL level. But as you mentioned, I mean, like there is a lot to like about him, and certainly character. And I think sometimes, those who do the pre-draft analysis look only at the film. They don't really kind of factor in the mental makeup part of it. And that's, a huge part of the evaluation process. And while I think, social media, arbiters of interviews or whatever, people or like that are like kind of playing on maybe the way he handled some of his previous interviews, or what, how he's looked, et cetera. Everything I've heard from behind the scenes, this kid is all, ball. As you mentioned, the intensity. He's a tough kid. You got to be willing to go over the middle, and he showed that in college. Obviously, the NFL will be a different level for him. But that middle field, just getting back to it, with this new Sean Mannion scheme, obviously the Shanahan comes from the Shanahan Sean McVay tree. They're going to do more in the center. They're going to have more play action. They're hoping to utilize that area, and that's certainly been an area that they've kind of not thrived in. And I'm not trying to point fingers here at the quarterback or the scheme or whatever. We don't know why. Whatever the reason is, well, I think we know there's a combination of reasons why. It's Jalen Hurts has never really felt comfortable throwing in that area, but I also feel that he's been kind of coached out of throwing into that area by Nick Sirianni and his coaches for fear of having turnovers. So there's kind of both ends of the argument there when you're looking about why they don't do enough of that. But it not only is it Makai Lemon, and here's my transition to the second round pick, Eli Stowers, tight end, traditionally will work more in the middle of the field. Stowers is an intriguing prospect because he's got kind of like big receiver ability, big receiver size. He's 6'4", 239 pounds. I think that makes him about the same size as someone like Mike Evans, and I've heard comparisons to him. But as Eli Stowers said to us last week, he's a tight end, and he wants to be a tight end, and that's the position that he has played these last several years. A former quarterback, though, there's a lot, I think, upside there, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Eagles pulled the trigger where they did. He tested outstandingly at the combine. In fact, he ran a faster 40 than Makai Lemon, 4.51. He had the highest vertical leap of any tight end in combine history. Stowers, what do you make of first of all, what do you make of the pick of the Eagles taking a tight end? Not a huge surprise, but maybe particularly this tight end, because we've heard so much about having one of those not blocking first tight end, but someone who can block, especially in this scheme. What'd you make of this pick?
Yeah, I think not a surprise, as you already said. We had a feeling that the Eagles were going to look to take a tight end in this year's draft because of Dallas Goedert's uncertain future. He's coming back on a 1-year deal, but beyond that, who knows? I think we've gone through this. Seems like every offseason over the last couple of years, and just there's been some uncertainty about Goddard's future, but he's coming back, and now he will have potentially, I guess, his heir apparent training beneath him in Eli Stowers, looking to potentially take the tight end one throne, whatever you want to call it, from Goddard at some point. And the way that they've done this and the way that they've done this now for several tight end one cycles with the Eagles is not necessarily throwing them into the fire right away, being able to learn as like a protege essentially. So the pick itself is not surprising. Yes, but there's a long way for Stowers to grow. As you mentioned, the receiving prowess that he showed at Vanderbilt in a very short period of time, making that transition in 2023 from quarterback to tight end. It's that's a quick jump, a big jump to make in a very short period of time for him. So it's understandable that not everything is there yet. And by everything, I mean, yeah, the blocking ability is going to need to take the next step at the NFL level. And ultimately, we saw last season what happens when your top tight end isn't really able to block very effectively, and what that does to the offense. And Goddard, who has historically been a solid blocker in his Eagles career, just didn't really have it last season. And I think the offense as a whole was worse off because of that. They didn't really have the blocking tight end. Now they've added Johnny Munt in the offseason to kind of fill that void. But ultimately, I think there's something to be said about having a player that can kind of do it all. And Stowers is not yet that player. Can he eventually get there? We will see. We'll talk a little bit about rookie minicamp, but I think it's fun to get to just see these guys out there. They're not doing a whole lot, especially in front of us in the session that we're allowed to see them. But with Stowers, I was kind of surprised, like how strong, kind of filled out he looked in terms of his frame. He was a lot stronger than perhaps obviously the testing numbers are good and solid, but just to see like how strong he was out there was maybe, I don't know, indicative of his potential down the line as a blocker. So we'll see if that translates. But yeah, we'll see how that all comes together for him.
Yeah, like again, when it comes to the blocking effort is a big part of it. Maybe they're making too much of that because if you don't have the physical skills to do it, but you can go a long way with just a willingness to learn the techniques that are required of blocking at this level. Like you just kind of got to survive at the tight end position because a lot of times you're taking on defensive ends. It's just like, okay, we got to run this play, just kind of like block them until you lose for a couple seconds, right? And we saw like Zach Ertz was a prime example of that. But I bring up Zach Ertz too because I feel like early in his career, didn't block a lot, didn't get on the field in certain circumstances because he couldn't do that, but he still was the F tight end in the slot and was explosive and dynamic. And I think Stowers can be that in the offense with Johnny Munt being the blocking guy. And look, Dallas Goedert, we know can block. Like he's done it before. Obviously, he's not as athletically where he was earlier in his career, but last year, I think maybe just because the whole entire offense, it was a byproduct of that. Maybe the willingness wasn't always there. I don't want to sit there and question his effort, but there were times when it just appeared that Dallas was not locked in, and you wonder where his mind was too. They had him take a pay cut. The same kind of applies this year, but I think he's going to have to understand his role, that he's not being as much being phased out, but like here's this kid, he's next in line, right? I mean. We'll see how many snaps he can get and how ready he is to play a bunch. But, it's going to be those three guys primarily at the tight end position. And I think with Stowers, because you have the other two, you can do other things with him. And I think they're going to get him on the field. I think he's going to be a matchup issue for teams because, obviously in the slot, down the seam versus linebackers, he's going to have a speed advantage. If you do want to flex him out, if you do want to put a safety on him in the slot, he's going to have a size advantage. And that's everything that the Eagles are salivating over when they look at Eli Stowers.